Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 1, Thinking Critically with Psychology. I recognize that the image you see in the textbook authors listed below are not those of the textbook we're using in class. The reason for that is I found this chapter really succinctly captures what I wanted you to know about psychology from a very broad perspective, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty details of names and dates, which really isn't consistent with sort of the style of learning I would like you to get to start the course. So I'll challenge you to think before we begin about what is psychology to you? What are the common things that come to mind? And you can pause it here and make a list of what you think it is. And we'll certainly discuss more about what psychology is later on in the course. But right now, it's just thinking about preconceived notions. And I'm assuming largely you'll consider it to be clinical psychology or counseling. Certainly, most people think that psychology is about helping others. By definition, it's the study of the mind. And with that said, it's not just human minds we're interested in, it also includes non human species as well, so animals. But for the first part, we really want to step back and ignore what psychology is or isn't and think about just science in general. And psychology is a science. Now, what constitutes a scientific discipline? It's the scientific method, which is where we're going to really start the course in Chapter 2. Right now, I want you to think about certain attributes that are fundamental for our understanding of really any behavior. One of them has to be curiosity. We want you to think about the world we're in, to explore the things that make our environments really unique, make them rewarding, certainly our experiences for sure. So to be curious would include a passion to explore and understand the world without misleading or being misled. Essentially, we're saying let's let the facts speak for themselves by using an empirical approach. Now, what does that mean? It would be the idea of experiencing the world and using our experiences to form the nature of how things work. Can you think of any challenges in gathering facts? Especially if you think about the goal is not to be misled or to be misleading for that matter. So questions we want to consider is what is it we mean? And ultimately, how do we know? Now, we can't experience everything to understand how things work. That would be impossible. But when we think about gathering information, while I want you to be curious, and I remember one of the quotes on an intro textbook I used a year ago by Stephen Hawking. It was look up at the stars and not down at your feet. Be curious, wonder, if you will, where everything has come from, where we're going. And that curiosity will lead you to then hopefully develop a healthy attitude of skepticism. I don't want people to become cynical, though, in our approaches to information gathering and being critical of everything or cynical for that matter. But I do think today it's important to question the behavior as well as the data that we're presented with, because the reality is we are bombarded with information. Each day we open up our social media feeds and we read something about whatever the something else we're reading is. And it's hard to know, if you will, what's true. I think about your own interactions with social media or the news outlets that you prefer to follow. Think about the stories they tell, the headlines that are there. Is it true? Is it accurate reporting? Is it even reporting or is it an opinion? So when we're presented with new findings, and we'll see, in this new study, it shows that. What is it that they showed? How did they obtain the data? Do you agree with their conclusion? Is their conclusion relevant for everybody or just a unique subset of the population? we call that a sample. It's also important if you're in science to express humility. We have to be aware of our own vulnerability to making a mistake or to error. We also have to have this willingness to be not necessarily surprised, but to be open to new perspectives. I recognize that I see the world the way that I see it. And I recognize that you experience the world obviously the way that you do as well. Does that mean if we both see the same thing, that we would share the same experience of it? Not necessarily. If you pause this and Google black and blue dress, and you might remember seeing this shared on social media a few years ago, but if you open that image up, do you see a black and blue dress, or do you see it as white and gold? We're not going to dispute the fact that it is indeed a dress. But for some of you who actually do this, you may see it like I do as white and gold. And I know that the actual dress is black and blue, and that others will see it as black and blue, but I can't. I can only see it the way that my brain interprets the light that reflects off the image on the screen through my eyes. It gets processed by my brain. It says it's white and gold. And I know it's hard to believe if you see it as black and blue, just like it's hard for me to believe that you see it as black and blue, because I don't. But that's the understanding that just because I see it a certain way doesn't mean that you have to see it a certain way, or that you should see it from my perspective. There's lots of ways when we think about collecting data, whether it's opinions or numbers from carefully crafted studies, that we can interpret those numbers based on the information we have, which becomes that pre-existing knowledge, which can lead us to see things, the way that we want to see them. So, for humility perspective, we want to be able to see the world for really what it is, and to change the way that we thought things worked to update with new information or better data, maybe better techniques. Because the reality is we're really bound to the techniques we have available to us, which we will cover later, to understand how behavior works or how things in our universe work as well. I can't emphasize enough that it's imperative that we think about critical thinking. So, not just when we're presented with information to be skeptical, but to really think about, is what we're reading, does it make sense? What's the basis of our ability to evaluate the knowledge that we're consuming? What kind of assumptions underlie the nature of the things that we are presented with? Most critically is the source of the information. Who's telling you? In folklore, you'll hear the famous friend of a friend phrase. Oh, I just heard this from a friend, and they got it from their friend. There's no credibility to the source of the information, but it sounds reliable because your friend is telling you that their friend heard this about whatever it is. So, where we get our information, you know, and are we then critical of what it is? Again, it's a reminder not to be cynical, but it's, what is the information that we have? Does it make sense? Are there any hidden biases in the conclusions being presented? Do you think you have the skills to evaluate the evidence? Maybe. But over the course of your university education, we'll certainly be thinking about giving you the correct tools, if you will, to think about what's going on with conclusions being made. Where did it come from? Is the source credible? Are they doing this with good intentions, or their hidden biases, or maybe explicit bias? You'll carefully evaluate the evidence, and ultimately, you'll be able to draw a conclusion. And the conclusions that we draw really are unique to the data that's represented from the samples that we collect while conducting research. It's important to think about conclusions really are limited from which the data they were collected. So we can't overgeneralize the results necessarily. And this can lead us to interesting findings. Maybe we debunk popular presumptions, and it can ultimately result in more effective policies. So when we conduct research and we think about science in general, it's really the training or the honing, fine tuning of these skills that allow subject matter experts to present information as best as they can with the interpretation of the results as accurately as possible to try to avoid these common pitfalls. When we think about how this is done, critical thinking at the heart of what we're trying to do is to analyzing than just simply accepting information. We critically evaluate conclusions. We do need to think about, are there flaws in the information collected? Are there alternative explanations that could account for facts or results? Are there any underlying assumptions, and deciding, do you agree with those? Are there any hidden biases, personal connections, discarding personal information or assumptions and ultimately viewing the data? I remember Andrew Wakefield published a article in the Lancet. So he published his research in a really famous journal called The Lancet, indicating from his conclusions that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine cause autism. And that conclusion sparked a great degree of controversy, if you will. Now, does it make sense if you think critically about, could the vaccine cause autism? I'm sure you've heard smoking causes cancer. And if I said to you, if you smoke one cigarette, are you going to develop cancer? You're going to say no. So does smoking cause cancer? What about if you smoke the pack? How long would you have to smoke to get it to cause it? Remember, causal is if you do something, it will happen. So if everybody gets vaccinated, what percent of the population do you think would develop autism? Now, today, it's about 4% of the population has been diagnosed under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And you might think, well, maybe it is related to something like vaccinations. But the hard truth of it all is Andrew Wakefield made up the data. He lost his medical license for forging the data. His article was retracted from the Lancet, meaning it doesn't exist today. And his conclusions are not supported by any evidence whatsoever. That's the challenge when we think about research is, do we have enough skill? And I don't mean that negatively, but just more critically, do we have enough background information to understand what was done? And if we don't, that's okay. I will admit that I'm, an expert in motor control because my doctoral dissertation was in how we use the feedback we get from our senses to control motor movements. But that's where it ends in terms of my expertise. It's a tiny little piece of a bigger discipline, if you will. Meaning, if you really open up an intro textbook, what I do is just maybe a page or two of what the entire book has. So when we think critically about conclusions, when we think critically about what's presented to us, sometimes it's really difficult. So in this instance, we want to be able to give us and you the skills to talk about the things that we're presented with, to really think about what they are, and ultimately allow you to become a stronger student in evaluating information and understanding what's presented to us in the real world. Because you really are bombarded with information every single day. So this is really the good place to start. And the gist of what we would do if we were in person is just cover this material and, of course, discuss it, which I recognize we can't do here. But I want you to really think about the information you're presented with. Do you just take it all at face value? And if you don't, what are the things that you look for in accepting the conclusions presented? I hope you enjoyed this first sort of overview of science and really not necessarily psychology at all. But we're going to jump into that momentarily when we talk about research methods. So we'll see you there. Have a great day.